for Twitch to catch up and make sure it's working. Looks like we're okay. All right. So I am broadcasting for today's reading, and I managed to misplace my book already. There it is. From my apartment at my boarding school where I work with my wife. Today I'm going to read chapter 1. I will do a quick recap of what happened in the prologue. I'm going to try to do that every time that there's a reading. I'll try to recap sort of the main points that were hit in the previous section. So if you jump in a little late, or if you are a little confused as to what happened exactly last time, you don't want to listen to the whole thing again, I'm going to recap it. I also will upload, hopefully tomorrow, the first episode and this episode to YouTube, and I will share that channel somewhere on the Twitch page and through Twitter and everything else. You can probably tell that this is not an ideal broadcasting setting, but it'll work just fine for today. Still haven't got the mic situation totally worked out, but most people seem to think the audio went just fine with yesterday's reading, so I'm going to stick to this until I hear otherwise and get something better put in place. The only other thing is that the TH Paul Plays sessions that I've been trying to run, currently I can't run anything off the PC because I don't have a reliable internet setup for it yet. That should be fixed tomorrow. And same thing goes for something like Bloodborne, which I'm playing on PS4. I can't stream that because it doesn't hold the connection strong enough to stream it properly. So if you caught the 30-second clips that put up a Bloodborne, that was me attempting to stream over Wi-Fi, and it did not work. So that should be fixed tomorrow, like I said. I'll do Q&A again at the end of this session, and I'm happy to answer any and all questions from anybody who's listening. If you come up with a question or something and you don't catch the live stream chat, you can't send me one there, just direct message me via Twitch or Twitter, and I'll try to get back to you, or I'll save it for a later episode, and I will answer it then. So I'm going to jump to chapter 1, find my place, and then I will recap sort of what happened in the prologue. Okay, so the prologue, fairly complicated. There's a couple different scenes. The first scene is opening with someone who we do not recognize or know, and we are given no name for it, staying at an inn, who is asked to tell a story, which then begins the actual story, which opens with a scene of gods meeting. They're called the First Gods. There are 14 of them. There's an obvious conflict among them over what to do about the mortal world that they helped create and the people in it. They resolve to allow the direct interference of a god in the life of a mortal, specifically to give that mortal or mortals the abilities of the god, a piece of the god, as it were, only if asked. They can't just go around bestowing it on anyone. And they learn that this is, in fact, very difficult to do, as most mortals won't be able to survive the process. Jump forward to a character known as Bullwife Margrave, a.k.a. Bull the Warrior, in a fortress besieged on all sides, and his second-in-command, Vakhtyn el Vak. They are met with a young man named Trem Waterhound, who is half-elven, who has saved his commander after they were jumped outside the fortress on a reconnaissance mission, and Trem has made a sword in the fortress of Aves, which is the first rank for those attempting to become Eagle Knights. That entire exchange is observed by the goddess of life, Elenormir, who was at the meeting in the first part of the prologue, and she feels uncertain as to Trem's future. That wraps the prologue, and now we're going to jump into the main story, which includes a time jump. So we have leapt forward in time, and we are rejoining Trem. So, chapter 1. Try to get the book positioned in a decent spot here. Silverleaf Forest was older than memory. Kings and queens came and went, castles rose and fell, wars were won and lost, but Silverleaf remained. The great forest spread from the Syrian Sea in the west to the far water in the east, a belt across the southern edge of the continent Lagotia. Silverleaf was vast, and its trees grew thick, casting great shadows on the forest floor, but permitting enough light for determined saplings and ferns to cling to life. It has aptly been called a living wasteland, the only humanoids populating it being the Foresters, a nomadic, nature-worshipping civilization of elves and a few men. The forest was impassable to most, but its secret avenues and trails were well known to the elves of Silverleaf and their allies. Once, before invasions had thrown the continent into a prolonged period of strife and conflict, there had been actual roads south, fueled by prosperous trade with the dwarven city of Glimmerhold. Now none wandered the ragged remains of the old Southron road, fearing ghosts and ghouls that many swore were more than children's stories. Even in daylight, the canopy of Silverleaf Forest keeps the land beneath its branches dim and gloomy. Many are unnerved by the absence of sunlight, but some are comforted by the dark and take solace in it. The foresters shield themselves in the nest of leaves and twisting arms of trees. Rarely is an outsider thus comforted. Many purportedly brave men walk the rolling knolls of Silverleaf Forest, but few stay long and fewer still venture in after night has fallen. On this night, however, a figure did stir. In the dark, he was but a shadow of a shadow, his steps quieter than his breath. He moved with a strange, unnerving grace that spoke of power barely restrained and a deep guilt boiling below the surface. This man was Trem Waterhound. His years at the fortress of Aves were long in the past, forcibly forgotten, though his face showed no mark of the passage of such a lengthy time. He had done his best to forget and become one with his new surroundings. Here the night was his friend, and Silverleaf his home. He flitted in and out of the trees, stalking inner enemies along narrow paths. He carried only a long hunting dagger strapped to his knee-high deerskin boots, seemingly his only protection among the beasts of the wood. His movements were quick and decisive, his eyes assessing and committing his body to action in a flash. It was an impressive sight, but also a feat born from experience. Trem was no stranger to Silverleaf, and had not been for some time. Trem had lived most of his days in the wood, and he knew his way among its gnarled roots. Here he was safe at last, for life among civilized people of Tethtanir had been fraught with danger for him and those about him. Among the trees of Silverleaf he knew only the animals and plants of the forest, deliberately steering clear of the remaining stretches of abandoned roads in the wood that a curious adventurer, or fool, might travel. Tonight, however, deep in his thoughts, something intangible drew him along a thin path he'd never traveled. Clad in his cloak and weather-beaten leather jerkin, he swept through the trunks of great wood like a breeze. Brushing up against deer and wolves that barely noticed his passing, he flew along his newfound trail, reveling in the illusion of solitude. His body was unchanged, healed perhaps from his time and service to Aves, but still full of strength and agility unmatched by almost any other mortal. Only Trem's eyes betrayed his true age. They spoke of haunting experiences beyond count, but nothing in his past could explain the powerful draw of the invisible road he now followed. Something appeared on the path before him, and he slowed his breakneck pace. The folded mound on the forest floor was something unfamiliar, resembling no animal he'd ever encountered here. He came upon it slowly, hearing through his sensitive ears only a faint whisper of breath. Trem knelt down, sensing no threat from the form. He felt cloth, a cloak like his own, and slowly rolled the mass over. The youth, as Trem assessed him, was horribly ashen in countenance. Even for Trem's sharp ears, his breathing was still barely noticeable from such a distance. Something had happened to this man, and for all his instincts clamoring that he should leave and never look back, Trem found himself searching for the source of injury. The man wore strange armor, hard, dark leather with studded, shined bronze bolts at regular intervals across his chest and torso. There were marks of a sharp metal on some and stitched sections of the leather, but they were small and few. Considering the unconscious figure was dressed for battle, Trem paused in his examination to search for the weapon he might have been carrying. Nothing about his attire fit with any nation or organization Trem knew of, but he was hoping for some clue to his homeland in the arms he carried. Trem's keen eyes spotted a heavy-looking broadsword some 10 feet from where the young man had fallen. Walking over, Trem knelt and hefted it, feeling its considerable girth contrasting with its excellent balance. It had no insignia and a simple design, but with a single deep blood channel running nearly the length of the blade's center. There was nothing to learn from the weapon, but he picked it up anyway. Trem then returned to the prostrate body. Setting the heavy blade down beside the unconscious form, he resumed his inspection of the young man. At last he pulled loose several straps and peeled back his armor, finding a ragged gash deep in his left side. Trem breathed a sigh of relief when he saw there was no immediate suggestion of infection. It seemed the loss of blood was the real reason the boy was in such dire straits. Trem paused as he considered his next move. Then, with a shake of his head at his own foolishness, he bent low and hefted the body onto his shoulders, sheathing and taking up the fallen sword as he did. Perhaps he chose to help the other man because of his lineage. He was also a half-elf, like Trem, though a few years beyond his Naivalan, the point at which both the elven and human traits are equally balanced and at their strongest. All the unique physical abilities of both races are at their height during this age, and the individual is hardier and swifter than any purebred human or elf can be. Eventually, often swiftly, this heightened period of bodily superiority passes, the individual's physical makeup trending towards one side of their parentage. This youth was beyond his Naivalan, and his characteristics had chosen to follow more human lines than elven. He still had the faint, angular, and pointed ears of an elf, and his sharply contoured cheekbones were striking, but his build was thicker and broader, and his hair coarser. Trem regretted, at the moment at least, that his being more human had increased his weight as well. How this man had managed to drag himself to this part of the woods was beyond Trem's reckoning. He remembered the old road, the one connecting Lagotia to her sister continent of Southron, lay through the trees at least 3 miles east. The man might have come from there, but he would have been virtually blind and without much sense or purpose. He had probably stumbled around aimlessly for some time and would not know which way to go if he survived, Trem merely patching his wound and leaving him in the forest. In truth, that was what Trem wanted to do, because while his charge was unconscious now, if he did succeed in reviving him, the stranger would be awake, and questions were sure to follow. For now that was forgotten, Trem could see the telltale signs of a fever in the sweat rising on the forehead, bobbing over Trem's right shoulder as he walked through the undergrowth. He could sense the heat coming from the unfortunate man's injury, and feared he had been mistaken in his initial assessment of the wound. The man groaned and muttered incoherent words, but did not open his eyes. Trem now felt certain there was a fever, and it was worse than he had first expected, likely brought on from too much time lying on the forest floor and too much blood lost. His concern suddenly increased tenfold. Trem quickened his pace as much as he dared, determined to do something before it was too late. Quick break. Water. It's hot in this room. It took Trem almost an hour to reach his cabin, a ramshackle structure butting up against one of the thick trees of the forest. Once he was inside, he removed all of the traveler's armor in his thin pack, resting it outside the door with his sword. Placing these items carefully in the corner of the main room, he laid the man on his makeshift bed and re-examined the wound. As Trem perused it, he removed his own battered jerkin and green tunic, ripped from hasty dash in the woods, replacing it with another more faded brown one. There was no obvious infection, but the skin was warm to the touch, and the flesh around the injury was reddening. Trem could not stop himself from assessing that the neat slicing gash indicated the wound was probably sword-inflicted. Making the youth as comfortable as possible, he departed quickly into the woods to search for what he required. A short time later, he was back with some white round berries, shiny cross-shaped leaves, and some large reddish roots. He now had what he needed to battle the fever. Crushing the few berries he wanted for the first dose, he set the rest aside on a rickety, unbalanced table. Slicing one of the roots, Trem tossed it into a small wooden bowl with the berries, along with the thick, pulpy fluid squeezed from a leaf. When he mixed this with one hand, he squeezed more sap from the leaves onto a cloth on his table. He then added some hot water he had boiled outside in his old copper pot to the mixture of root, leaf, and berry. Taking this and a poultice cloth into the bedroom, he sat down next to the young man. Carefully, he peeled away the worn leather and eyed the injury. He had cleaned around it as best he could, and the clothes and armor had stopped it from bleeding, but the scabbing was incomplete, swollen, and raw. Readying himself, Trem pressed the poultice down hard on the wound. The injured man gasped and howled as he tried to rise, but Trem held him down with one hand and forced him to drink every drop of the mixture he'd concocted. This process was repeated twice more that day and once later at night, each time rousing his patient long enough to make him ingest the medicine before he passed out once again. Trem knew he was doing all he could. It would be a measure of the man's will that would decide if he lived or died. Trem stayed at his cabin for over a week, monitoring the outsider. The hermit slept under the sky so as not to awaken his charge, for he rested at odd hours, and when he dreamt it could prove disruptive to those around him. The wounded man seemed to suffer a similar challenge, often screaming in his sleep or talking in desperate tones. Though his rambling was often incoherent, one afternoon Trem finally was able to piece together at least a part of what had led him to collapse alone in the middle of the forest. Trem was holding down the healing cloth against the injury, but feeling no resistance from the youth's body, he feared his guest had finally succumbed to the fever. He eased the pressure on the now stitched and cleaned gash, and leaned in close to check the young man's breathing. Trem almost fell back as the bloodshot eyes wrenched open and a tautly muscled arm ripped forward to grasp his tunic. "No, Manic, you're staying with us. We're not going to die here, not alone." Trem managed to remove the man's death grip from his shirt and set him back down gently. The youth continued to ramble, however, his terrible story rolling out uninterrupted. Trem remained applying the treatment he had prepared, and while he sat, he listened intently to the snippets of the story. His guest had an unusual tale to tell, and from his eavesdropping and this sudden reliving of the most traumatic event, Trem was able to piece most of it together. The stranger had been wandering a road through the forest with some companions. They were on their way to a place called Gailakill, a town in the middle of the Dust Plains that Trem knew well. Gailakill had a reputation as a traveler's haven, a walled town welcoming to every race of mortal, and a good place to hear news and rumor. Trem had spent his fair share of time there in his youth, and it was a welcoming settlement that didn't bat an eye at half-elves wandering around. Perhaps this rarity had been what drove Trem's guest there as well. The group he was traveling with had come from Dragon's Watch, the fertile western coastal valley north of Silverleaf Forest. They had followed the main road east, a straight shot that should have led them past the southern end of the Dragonscale Mountains and to Gailakill. Trouble had struck once they reached the Dust Plains. A motley group the young man called the Broken, a name meaning nothing to Trem, apparently threatened anyone on the road. This marauding band had set upon the man's companions and himself, nearly killing 2 of them in an ambush. In his fevered ravings, the injured youth gave few details. Though he rambled for hours, Trem was unable to put a name to most of the man's company, and only through concentration could he reconstruct the events of the stranger's unfortunate journey in the proper order. Trem's focus rewarded him when the boy finally reached the breaking point of his sickness. In the throes of his fever, the injured youth recalled how he had come to the woods. Following the first attack, the party had few options. To retreat would have left them exposed on the open plain, and pushing onward would move them still closer to the broken-infested lands around Guylick. Instead, the group had chosen to head south, a shorter march across the plains, and into Silverleaf along the old Southron Road, which should have later connected to another road leading to Guylick, while keeping them far less visible. Their travel was slower, however, with one of the wounded having to be carried. The young man repeatedly cried out, "No, we'll carry you, Manic. I'm not leaving you for the bastards. You won't slow us down. You just need to hold on." They had not counted on Broken following them out of the plains and into the forest. The enemy displayed an unnerving cunning as well, managing to get ahead of the man and his allies, and laying an ambush at one of the forgotten road's turns. There had been too many for the youth and his fellows to handle, and a friend had apparently pushed him toward the woods, telling him to run. The youth had refused, and his friend had been killed an instant later. The attacker was also apparently the one responsible for the wound in the stranger's side. The young man had fled deep into the trees without any thought to direction, and had by sheer luck evaded his attackers until dropping where Trem found him. The story pieced together at last, Trem felt a pang of sorrow at what had happened to this traveler at such a young age. Trem had lived a life of death and danger, trying and failing to find his place amid great conflict, and he had accepted that his lot long ago, and chosen a new life that spared him the trials of his past. This young man, a half-elf like Trem, did not appear to have any violent intent, and it meant great suffering nonetheless. Trem had made it his business to keep his distance from other mortals, but he still felt a deep sympathy to this youth, merely a child in his mind. The same day he came to understand the full scope of the man's tale, the fever broke, and Trem, feeling confident he could leave his charge alone to get without worry, went to hunt for dinner with his old, worn longbow. Quick break. On his return from a fruitless hunt, Trem did not enter the cabin, but stayed outside to cook the remaining meat of the deer he'd killed days before into a thick stew. In his years amid the solitude of the woods, he'd learned to care for himself, but now he found he was concerned with another as well. He took his time, knowing that with the fever broken, his guest might well be awake and about able to speak. While Trem tried to convince himself otherwise, he was nervous about the prospect of talking to another person after so long. Using the excuse to cook the savory venison would save him from the interaction a while longer, but eventually he had to bring it into the cabin to feed his guest. Turning the spoon in the pan over his fire for what seemed to be the thousandth time, Trem sighed in committance. Picking up the pot carefully with a cloth-wrapped hand, Trem finally went inside to meet the man he had gone to such pains to save. Trem came through the front door holding the battered pan before him as it smoked and spattered. He eased it onto his poorly made table and kept the stand steady with one hand as he spooned a hearty portion of the concoction into 2 bowls. The would-be chef hefted the bowls carefully, judging whether he'd fairly distributed their contents, and moved towards the gap in the wall that divided his entryway from his bedroom. Entering the tiny space, Trem saw his patient sitting up in bed and looking around, dazed and unsure of his new surroundings. Trem's arrival brought a look of confusion that gave way to obvious yearning when the injured man saw the hot stew. Setting his own bowl down on the small nightstand next to the bed, Trem walked over and handed the man his food. Taking it between his legs, the youth managed to croak out, "Water." Trem left immediately and went down to the nearby stream with the mostly cooled old copper kettle. When he came back, the eyes of his guest seemed to be burning through the bowl before him. Realizing he could not eat until he'd had something to drink, Trem helped the man swallow greedily from the kettle until it was emptied. Sitting back against the rough wall, his eyes closed, the youth sighed and spoke. "How long have I been here?" "You've lain in this place over a week," Trem answered, finally settling into a squat against the living tree that occupied one corner of the room to eat his own meal. He found he hesitated to take the first bite, unsure of how he should act. Trem was a little unnerved to hear the sound of his own voice, but simultaneously pleased to hear that of another. His mind worked on 2 levels at once, ever cautious. Though he was happy to speak with another person, he could not remember the last time he had talked to anyone, and the alien nature of the moment made him wary. There was, after all, a reason he had holed himself away from the world. A week. The man's eyes opened wide and he stared at the wall, a faraway look encompassing his gaze. "You did not find anyone else?" Trem chewed a small bite from his bowl before answering slowly. "No, I'm sorry. I do not believe your friends made it." The injured man locked his eyes on Trem. "How do you know I was not alone?" "You had a fever. Though you spoke of many things, I managed to reason out your fate." Trem let the comment hang, knowing he should express some sympathy or compassion for this unfortunate wastrel, but he could not find the words. Yes, I suppose you might. The stranger spared Trem the discomfort of the moment. Having lost interest in his meal, the patient stared at the wall again, and neither man spoke for some time. Trem kept his eyes down on his bowl, but from beneath his brow he studied his companion more thoroughly. He was strong, despite the ravages of the injury and illness, possessing a square chin and curly, tousled light brown hair. His eyes were a deeper brown and stood out very faintly from his lightly tanned skin. For a Lagosian, he was a bit darker than most, though not the deeper brown of someone from Westia. More than his complexion, Trem noted the other features, such as a lack of scars, a sign of inexperience in battle. Though his build was clearly that of a warrior, hard and weathered, this was not a soldier lying in his bed. For one so young, though he might not bear the physical marks, Trem could tell he'd been through much. Against his own better judgment, Trem felt a part of him reach out to the innocence of his guest with an unnervingly strong sense of protectiveness. This was a youth raised to accept hardship, but who did not yet know what hardship was. Before Trem could finish his thoughts, the eyes turned back to him anew. You're a little young to be a hermit. It was a piercing accusation and a wise observation that Trem had not anticipated. Unprepared for this moment, the host tried to cover his discomfort with a simple response. I prefer the solitude. I've lived here most of my life. Alone? Trem nodded decisively, his brief twinge of fear fading. Always. The young man said nothing. He merely closed his eyes again, then spoke with a deliberate calm. If you did not learn it before, I would have you know my name is Jovanaleth. I'm a frontier warrior, a ranger from the Order of the Blade. Jovanaleth, Trem repeated thoughtfully. It is not a name whose origin I'm familiar with. My mother chose it when I was born, but my father always said it was too formal. Most people know me as Jovanaleth of the Blade, but my father calls me Jovan instead. Of the Blade, Trem said curiously. That is an odd title. It simply means I hail from the Order of the Blade, as I said before. Trem stared blankly, this information clearly not registering with him. Have you not heard of my people? No, Trem replied. I can't say I've ever heard of such a group. Sitting up slightly, Jovanaleth eyed Trem anew. How long have you lived in the forest? Longer than you believe, Trem answered. Tell me about your home. Jovanaleth sat up further, clearly taken with the subject. It was founded in a caldera, north of Dragon's Watch. My father's surname is Blade, taken from his past as a pirate and brigand on the high seas. He formed the order and founded the city, both of which bear his name. The city's young, but already there are many who've come to live there. It seems we never stop building new homes. Jovanaleth settled into the covers a bit more. You know the story of the final battle at Aves, in the War of the Lion. Trem kept his eyes on his guest. I do. My father was there, an officer among the knights. Jovan seemed not to notice his host's discomfort. He led the only unit composed of non-humans. They came to Aves as volunteers. The Eagle Knights would never accept them until things got so dire they had no choice. After the traitor Vakhtyn Elvak killed Bull the Warrior, there was a great fracturing among the knights. Some blamed the commander for inviting non-human males to the order, for violating tradition. Others claimed those same people saved the order. My father had fought with those who would never have been allowed to join under previous regimes, and regarded them as brave and valiant men. He would not return to a prejudiced and chauvinistic tradition after that. Instead, he chose to, and he and all those who were disillusioned with the Eagle Knights left Aves in control of Richard Margrave III, a man who had never served in battle but was somehow made the new commander of Aves. He went north to found Bladeholm, a new city for a new order that would welcome any seeking to defend the weak. As Jovanaleth spoke, Trem could see the fervor of belief in his face. We are a young order, but we're growing rapidly. Trying to shift away from the subject of the war without being too obvious, Trem asked, what became of the Eagle Knights? Jovanaleth shrugged. Many of them stayed, and they still hold sway over much of the land they defended before the War of the Lion. Halden Bay still exchanges them goods for protection, and they have refilled their ranks somewhat, but they also still harbor their prejudice and distrust of all non-humans. My father certainly does not feel the same way. Trem nodded in understanding. Because your mother was an elf. Jovan was caught off guard by Trem's insight, but then realized the conclusion was quite clear with some simple deduction. Yes, he hid it from the knights while he was at Aves, but it came out after the war. I think that also motivated him to leave. The most dogmatic members of the knights still consider him a traitor for loving an elf. They were quiet for a time, and Trem motioned to Jovanaleth to eat his stew. The host took his own bowl from the room and washed it in the rain barrel outside before rejoining his guest. The bowl was empty, and Trem took it wordlessly to rejoin the first outside by the wash basin. Jovanaleth shifted in bed and flexed his legs with a grimace. Could I join you? Outside, I mean. Trem eyed his patient skeptically, but offered him an arm. It took a good deal of time and plenty of support from his host, but Jovanaleth reached the doorway of the cottage at last. There he waved Trem off and leaned against the doorframe, wincing as the skin of his injured side stretched slightly. Trem looked up and saw the pained expression as he scrubbed the wood bowl clean with rough, dried moss. "Be careful moving about. I'm not much of a seamster, and my second effort is unlikely to be better than the first." Joven made no reply, but turned slightly to use his back and thighs to hold his body upright, avoiding extending his arms about the waist. The pain receded gradually, and he studied the clearing in which Trem had built his home. It was a minimalist life, from what Joven could see. There was a roughly arranged stone ring for his fire pit, with a small three-legged iron stand for holding various cooking implements. An old stump, likely the former residence of one of the logs composing Trem's home, served as a spot for splitting wood. Aside from those features, the exterior was lightly trod earth covered in long fallen nettles from the trees about it and many vein-like roots that crisscrossed the ground. It would have taken a mere 10 strides from the fire pit or cottage to reach the green undergrowth of the forest, and perhaps a few more besides to evaporate among the vast nest of living curtains all around. Trem had scrubbed Joveneleth's bowl and was now cleaning the iron vessel he'd cooked the meal in, but he passed Joven another small ration of water in the battered copper pot he had provided before. Joveneleth drank it deeply and examined the wood about him once again, this time hearing the faint call of birds and the rustle of animals small and large all around. He strained his head upward, and though he could feel and see the fingers of sunlight through the canopy, he could not see the mighty orb in the sky. "What time do you suppose it is?" Trem did not look up. "Perhaps a few hours beyond midday. You should return to bed soon. You'll be needing rest for several more days before you can move about freely again." Joven would have liked to protest, but he was tired. With resignation, he handed Trem back his pot and took his shoulders as a crutch once more. Trem lowered him gently as he could to the bed and said, "Tomorrow I'll change the dressing to the wound, and you can move about a bit more. If you feel comfortable, perhaps you can sit outside." Joven thanked him and, despite himself, began to nod off while Trem was still in the room. The stoic half-elf watched him for a time, then went outside and breathed deeply and steadily, his eyes closed, trying to calm himself. Joveneleth had a surname Trem knew well, a name from his past, and he had grave suspicions as to who his father was. It would be better if he were gone, and soon. Trem briefly considered the convenience of forcibly ending the youth's life himself, but though it was practical, it was beyond him. He had done this much to aid him so far. It was too late to turn hostile now. Accepting that he would have to deal with the consequence of saving this traveler's life, Trem went into the woods in search of food for the next day. A quick pause, another section. This is a shorter section than the one I read yesterday, so there's only, looks like, a couple more pages in chapter 1 to go. So, and then I'll do some Q&A, and I do have a map I can show anybody who wants to see some of the locations. The following morning, Joveneleth awoke earlier, before noon, and Trem was waiting with fried eggs and an assortment of berries and roots for him to eat. The young man was famished and devoured them all with haste, only afterward asking in horror if he had eaten Trem's share as well. This actually caused his host to chuckle audibly before explaining he'd fed himself some hours before, and Joven should not be concerned. After all, you're the one who needs sustenance to heal. Placated, Joveneleth began to make preparations to leave the confines of his bed again, but his host did not move to help him. Instead, Trem seemed frozen in thought and uncomfortable with what had taken roost in his mind. At last, he seemed to come to a decision, and said, "Joveneleth, in your feverish ramblings, you mentioned a group you called the Broken. Who are they?" Joven sat back slightly, temporarily abandoning his exodus from the cabin. "That's what they call themselves, but in the beginning I think it was a name given to them. When the army of the Lion was defeated, many boarded ships and returned to the west, across the Syrian Sea. But there were not enough boats to take them all. The rest that stayed in Dragon's Watch were routed in short order, but many fled to the Dust Plains and began harassing merchants and other travelers there. Some even grew so bold as to raid farms or villages. They're no longer soldiers. Most have mixed with the bandits that already roamed the hills and made bigger raiding parties. They have been a threat to the region since the war ended. And these are the men that attacked you." "Yes." Joven's voice was soft, but gained strength as he went on. "It's not the first time I have fought them. Some years ago, a chieftain named Shatrax raised a great many of the Broken to his banner, and had the audacity to attack Bladeholm. Some say he had a gem he believed would give him the strength to bring down the walls of the city. He was apparently a shaman of some power, but it failed. Most of his army died against the stone rising from the caldera, or were driven back to their camps in the Dust Plains. He himself is still a prisoner in Wretch's Hole." Wretch's Hole? "A prison my father had built to house criminals. There are some there for crimes within the city, but there are smaller cells and holding places for the minor offenses. Wretch's Hole was originally built to find and punish those who had done terrible things to the people of Dragon's Watch while in service to the army of the Lion. Many of their officers who were left behind are now rotting in there." Trem did not question further, but helped Joveneleth to rise and make his way outside. It was easier than it had been the first day, and Joven was able to bear much of the weight on his own. Trem sat him in the doorway and leaned him back on his elbows while he examined the wound. The cloth was blood-stained, but most of it was dry. The injury was healing and seemed far less inflamed and discolored than before. Joven winced as Trem did a thorough examination, but the time it took to assess the wound and reapply a bandage was mercifully brief. As he sat up, his hand stealing instinctively to the injured side, Jovanileth said, "You know, it would be easier to talk if I knew what to call you." Trem was taken aback, having never considered that he had not mentioned his name to his guest. For a moment he thought it might be better to give him a false one, but he reasoned few had known his name when he was not hiding in Silverleaf, and letting the truth out now could do little harm. "My apologies. My name is Trem Waterhound." Jovanileth laughed and grimaced at the pain it caused him, but despite himself laughed once more with a bit more control. "Waterhound? You said you could not place the origins of my name, but that one surely defies belief." Trem stood still and stern, replying through thin lips, "My parents chose their family name. My father was fond of otters. He considered them similar to dogs, and they could always be found in water. We were poor and not given a name of grandeur or repute like some more fortunate people." Jovanileth realized his reaction had offended his host and held up his hands in sincere apology. "I'm sorry, Trem, I meant no offense. It's a fine name." To demonstrate his sincerity, Joven rose from the stoop with great effort and extended his hand in greeting, trying unsuccessfully to hide the pain it caused him as his face tightened. "A pleasure and great fortune to have met you, Trem Waterhound." Trem did not smile, but his face relaxed significantly, and he accepted the outstretched hand. "Thank you, Jovanileth the Blade. The pleasure is mine." Trem then had to catch Joven as he stumbled forward, and admonishingly, he led him towards the great stump he chopped his kindling on and set him down. "Politeness is no excuse to injure yourself further. Rest here." Jovanileth would have protested, but he did not have the strength. He sat on the stump for some time, the world swimming before him. Gradually the dizziness and nausea subsided, and he was able to raise his head. He flexed his hands and feet and sighed. He could not see Trem, and suspected he had gone off to pursue any number of chores and duties necessary to surviving alone in the forest. Joven was not able to sit still long. He became antsy, and reasoned he was a bit thirsty, and he ought to be able to reach the water barrel himself and quench his thirst. He rose gingerly, paused to stabilize himself and test his strength, and began the arduous journey across the small clearing outside Trem's cottage. There were several stumbles and near falls, but he eventually reached the barrel and clutched its wooden top with grateful hands. He did not hear Trem approach, but he was beside him suddenly, a look of genuine concern mixed with chastisement on his face. "It seems leaving you alone for even a moment is unwise." Joven glowered at him from beneath his sweat-coated brow. "I was thirsty." Despite himself, Trem smiled slightly and then swept away. Jovanileth saw he was carrying several sizable rabbits, and looked to be some kind of larger rodent he could not identify. Trem sat down by the fire pit and set about butchering the animals, while Joven, now truly parched and wanting to savor the victory of his challenging stroll, took a long drink straight from the rain barrel. He felt refreshed and thrust his head beneath the water, pulling it free and tossing his hair backward as he exhaled. The water was colder below the surface than he expected, but it made him feel more alive than he had since he awoke from the fever. Turning back to the fire pit, he leaned against the barrel and watched Trem. The hermit's back was to him, and he was deftly gutting and arranging the carcasses he'd brought with him. His speed with the hunting knife was impressive and precise, and Joven suspected he could have completed the task with his eyes closed if he needed to. As Trem turned to reach for the last rabbit, he saw Joven staring at him and froze. Jovanileth feared he'd offended the hermit again, but Trem asked, "Do you like tea?" Caught off guard, Joven replied hesitantly, "Yes, my mother used to serve it to me sometimes." Trem did not answer, but went quickly into his house. Joven debated hobbling over to the fire pit while his host was rummaging about in the cottage, then decided against it. The other man appeared a short time later carrying a small wooden box, elegantly carved with the image of two dragons, mouths open, facing off at one another. Trem unlatched the lid and held it open in front of his guest. "Choose one." Jovanileth could see the delicate bundles of tea were unmarked, and was at first unsure how to proceed, but as Trem held the box a bit closer, he understood he was meant to smell them, and leaned in. Finding an odor he deemed not too pungent and overwhelming, he pointed to his selection. Trem nodded in approval, and the copper pot was put back to its duties in short order. Jovanileth was waiting again as Trem examined the small shelf in his cottage for the proper receptacle, and then he came out with a small clay pot and two tiny handless cups. Joven was now thoroughly intrigued and, with grim patience, made his way to the fire pit. He set himself down on a horizontal log and watched as Trem carefully lifted the heated water and poured it into the teapot, placing the lid and watching the water overflow slightly with a look of stern satisfaction. "I've never seen teacups like those," Joven remarked. "I'm not surprised," Trem said as he watched the slow rise of steam from the clay. "They are more common to the south, and some places in the west, I hear. Where did you get them?" Trem hesitated slightly before saying, "Many of the items I have here are found on the old roads, abandoned carts, discarded packs, sometimes a poor soul's last resting place. Jovan accepted this with understanding and waited as Trem watched the steam rising from the pot, carefully evaluating when the tea had been brewed properly. Once satisfied, he poured out small gulps into cups and handed Jovaneleth one. This is a darker tea, as are all the ones on the row you chose from. I prefer them more in the morning, but they are quite invigorating at any time of day. The two sat sipping the tea quietly for a time. Jovaneleth was pleased at the taste, though he was curious as to the origins of his beverage, and mildly annoyed at being unable to confirm where it had come from. Trem seemed to relax a great deal with the cup in his hand, and was very forthcoming in offering Jovan more. They sat that way for close to an hour and did not speak, Trem because he simply was not one to talk much, and Jovaneleth out of respect for the serenity of his host. Trem finally broke the silence with a question, one that had been gnawing at him for some time. Jovaneleth, you said your father founded the Order of the Blade. If that's true, is he some sort of ruler, a king? And if so, doesn't that make you a prince? Jovan's face contorted in a look of mild frustration. Technically, yes. He hates the term and so do I, but I suppose it's an accurate way of looking at our roles. I see, Trem said. Then that raises a further question. What were you doing in Silverleaf Forest, so far from home? Jovaneleth had frankly been expecting the question for some time. He sighed and set his cup down. So that was one thing that my fever dreams apparently did not reveal. My father is missing. Missing. I suppose it's not the right way to phrase it. He's not lost or taken, but he's been gone from Bladeholm for over a year, closer to 2, in fact. And where did he go? Jovan shook his head. That is the problem. His mission was one of secrecy, and so it's impossible to know if he reached his destination safely or if he was waylaid by foes before getting there. Either way, he has been gone longer than he should have been, and I have to find him. Trem chose not to probe further, recognizing that Jovaneleth was unwilling to provide more than the vague details of his quest. Wasn't this, after all, what he wanted? The youth would heal, and Trem would lead him to the road once again, and then they would both go back to their old lives. Trem would remain hidden and sheltered from the rest of the world, and everything would move onward without him. Remaining locked in time was not so bad if you did not have to watch it pass by before you on the faces of other mortals. Trem rose and took the tea box in his clay pot inside, saying to Jovaneleth over his shoulder, You'll need to rest again, but feel free to stay by the fire as long as you like. I have to go hunting soon. My snares have been fruitful of late, but a deer lasts far longer than rabbits. Jovan did not answer, still unsure of his precise relationship with his host. He watched Trem enter the cottage and come out, now clad in his heavy cloak and carrying a quiver of arrows and a curved bow. Without a word or a glance, he strode towards the tree line and disappeared into the forest. Jovaneleth contemplated going back inside, but the fire was warm and comforting, so he remained. It was unfair of him to hold back the details of his father's disappearance. But then, Trem had held back far more if Jovan's instincts were right. Soon it would not matter, and he would be gone, and this strange and sad place would be behind him. So, that's chapter 1. I'm actually going to step out for a second, grab the map, because it was something people asked about last time, and show some of the locations that have been mentioned in the book, and when I come back, maybe people will have some questions and give a chance for people to think about stuff. So, give me 1 second, and I'll be right back. Okay, this is going to take a little juggling on my part. Let's see, do I put it to the side? Okay, so let's see here. Try to get it properly in the camera and yet keep me. I guess I don't really need to be in the camera, do I? Tilt this up a little bit. Okay, so what you're looking at here are actually 2 of the continents in the story. The section down here is South Ron. Section up here is what's called Lagotia. The tree line down here, that's Silverleaf Forest, and that kind of acts as sort of the border between those 2 continents. It's an unofficial border, sort of like if you think of Asia and Europe and their sort of division between those 2 landmasses. They're a connected landmass, but they're different continents. So Trem was at this point right here, which is Aves, that fortress you see at the end of my fingertip there. The region to the north of it, this whole area is called Dragon's Watch. It's a particularly fertile section of the world where a lot of farming and lumber and those sorts of industries happen because it's a good place for growing and producing that type of natural resource. There's the town you'll see just in the north there called Halden Bay, and further up you find a place called Bagram Bay, and just to the west of that is Bladeholme, which is, I think, a little bit difficult to see in here, but it's right up there. So this is where Jovan is originally from, up there. His father was at Aves, where Trem also served. And Trem is now somewhere in this general region of Silverleaf. I didn't pinpoint it on the map because it wasn't especially essential, and it's sort of key to the story that you never quite know exactly where he is, except that you know he's somewhere in the western part of the forest. They make reference to the Empire of the Lion, the War of the Lion, and that refers to a nation that exists way over here. Nope, sorry, that's the other side. Way over here to the west. Okay, there's a whole other continent over there. This is the map that appears in the books, digital or paperback. And the reason that it's only the one continent is that in the first 2 volumes, the story takes place entirely in this part of the world. There's no reason to show you the other part because it's not actually going to be part of the events that occur. In the 3rd book I'm working on now, things do start to happen in the other sort of part of the world, which means we're going to have to figure out if we're going to be doing a full-page map, or a 2-page map that folds out, with one half of the world on one side and the other half on the other. But that's a problem for a different day and fairly far off. So, but yeah, so that just, for people that were wondering, that kind of gives you a general idea. So let's see if there's anything else. So Gylakill right there. That is in the middle of, as you see, the Dust Plains. That's the place that originally Jovan's trying to get to. So you are given the impression he made his way down through Dragon's Watch, cut across the base of the Dragonscale Mountains, and was probably going to head to Gylakill this way, and then was diverted into the woods when they were attacked by the Broken. So that sort of sets you up for what's going on and where they are. And it's important, I guess, just that you note that essentially the whole story encompasses just this one tiny area right now. Other parts of the world come into play later, but I wanted to make sure that it, even though it's maybe smaller on the map, the scope of what was happening felt real and big and that kind of thing. So that's the map. I could break that out for other purposes later on, and when other places get referenced, or if people have questions about other places, I can try to refer to them. So, okay, I'll readjust the mic so you can see my camera rather. So I can hang out for a minute and do Q&A, and then that'll be it. That was just that chapter. I'm actually going to look and see, in some cases, if chapters are shorter, I'll probably read more than one chapter in a session. But the prologue's pretty long. That chapter's a decent chunk. And then let's see. Yeah, chapter 2 is going to be fairly lengthy as well, so that'll be a good fit. Yeah, chapter 2 is over 20 pages, so that'll be one chapter, so essentially 3 chapters a week is going to be the intention. We'll see if that makes sense. There are 30 chapters in total, so I think if I did 3 a week, it was a 10-week process, which would basically take me through the summer and into the very start of the school year where I work. I may have to do a couple of double-up weeks in there, or days rather, in there, so that we get everything in. Yeah, I'll wait a few minutes if people are in here. I can't see how many people are watching, and I'm actually trying to actively avoid worrying about how many people are watching. So if you've got questions, great. And if you don't, I'll say about 6:50-ish. I'll probably shut the stream down and call it good. I'm trying to think if there's anything relevant to mention. can't think of anything right now. I will, I guess, say, and I'll be interested as get through the reading for people who haven't read the book before but are listening to it more for the first time. Most of the feedback I got on the first book was that the opening, the proper chapters, not the actual prologue, is very slow, and that is 100% true. It's probably, I'm thinking personally for me, it's probably the biggest flaw with the book is the pacing of the beginning. However, it's one of those self-created flaws. I intentionally made it very slow. I want you to spend a lot of time with these two particular characters feeling each other out, and they're feeling each other out, and you're feeling them out. So, while I think that's a major kind of like flaw in the story because it does sort of slow you down and make you linger with them for a while, it makes other points later on feel more earned to me. And I really had a hard time starting the book when I first started. I think I wrote the opening 50 pages probably 10 different times. Some of them were very minor changes. Some of them were extremely different versions. Some of them skipped huge chunks that now appear in the book. This was, in my opinion, the best way to do it. I had editors look at it. I had various people give me feedback. And it kind of came to a consensus where the opening of the book is a little slow, but there's no easy way to fix that and keep what you want in terms of the development of characters the way it is. So, one of those challenges, I think one of the first things I learned when I started properly trying to write books was that starting it is much harder than any of the other stuff. Writing endings to books is tough too, but really getting them going and making it feel like you've got the reader on board with what's happening and giving a crap about what you're saying is harder than I thought. And that's definitely the toughest part for me. Oh, don't worry about it, White. I'm just about wrapped up. You can go back and catch the end of the chapter if you want to. Also, like I said, I'm going to put these on YouTube, and I am going to make sure that I recap every time I start reading what happened in the previous part so that you know what's going on, because there aren't a lot of plot lines going now, but as the story goes on, we get a lot more, threads pulling at the same time. And I'll bring the map back for future ones too. So, and the other thing that I will say is when I add this to YouTube, I'm going to try to put timestamps on it so you know when the actual reading is happening, when the intro happens, and when the Q&A happens. So that's it for today. As White has alluded to, go check out C-Team if you don't follow Penny Arcade and Jerry Hogan's D&D extravaganza. It's really worth checking it out. I got a chance to actually talk to Jerry directly at PAX East this year, and he'd always talked about writing a book, and I really wanted him to write a book. And I asked him, do you think that this is you writing a book, DMing this game? And he essentially said that he thinks that this has done it. That's his book. His book is running this game for really awesome people, and it's a pretty great story, so it's worth checking out. I haven't caught much of the second season, but the first season was fantastic, and I can't wait to kind of binge the whole second one. So that'll be it for today. I'll be back on Friday, 6 o'clock for Chapter 2, and hopefully tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Maybe. It's going to be kind of fluctuating depending on what else is going on. I would like to get back on Baldur's Gate and Siege of Dragonspear because it's starting to get a little bit interesting. It was a kind of a slow beginning, but some characters have been introduced, and we're learning a little more about the antagonists, so I feel like maybe that's going somewhere. And yeah, I will update. If you want to figure out what's been going on or what's coming up, just check out at Legacy Chronicle on Twitter. You can subscribe to the channel. That helps me out a great deal if you do that. And please check out the Penny Arcade channel, Purple Monkey Robots channel, and Clues channel on Twitch. You can also check out Whitefire, but I don't know, White, you haven't had videos up for a while because you're super duper busy. So, but those are all people who via Twitch have really helped and encouraged me to do not just the live reading, but also the Baldur's Gate playthroughs. So I want to show them some support too, and hopefully you can check them out. They are really excellent. When I finally get back to fixing and making this stream run the way it's supposed to, where you actually see notifications about, hey, check these things out, which I thought I had fixed, but I'm still learning Twitch. You'll be able to link to everything right from the channel. So thanks again. Hope everybody has a good evening or day wherever you are, and I will be back reading on Friday and playing something tomorrow.